Are you ready for a haunting and shocking story? Today, we will explore the life of Beau, a man whose wrong choices led to an irreversible tragedy. This story is not for the faint of heart. Let's watch it together. From the time he was a boy, Beau lived in a world of constant expectations and comparisons. His family, with a strict father and a mother with high expectations, created an environment where perfection was the only goal. His older brother, William, was an ideal model, a symbol of success in every aspect: academics, career, and a happy family life. Beau, on the other hand, always felt like a laggard, a pale imitation of his perfect older brother. The rare compliments he received always came with an underlying question: why can't you be better? He was used to looking in the mirror and seeing a distorted image of himself, someone who was always lacking and never good enough. During long, lonely nights in his small room, Beau would often look out the window, wondering if he would ever truly make his parents proud. He gradually withdrew into his shell, building invisible walls to hide his disappointments. Each failure was like a knife stabbing into his already fragile self-esteem. He learned to lie, find excuses to avoid responsibility, and gradually, avoidance became a part of him, a shadow that always haunted and controlled his actions. This constant pressure caused Beau to live in a state of tension and anxiety. He not only had to face expectations from his family, but also had to fight the negative and self-deprecating thoughts within himself. He became a man with a deep emotional wound, always longing for acceptance and love, but not knowing how to face and overcome the obstacles he had created himself. He was like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. And the tragedy that followed was only a matter of time. One cold winter morning at the University of Missouri, the laboratory was gloomy and filled with chemical odors. Beau, with his usual gloomy mood, was immersed in boring experiments, trying to hide the constant anxiety within him. Then, the laboratory door opened, and like a sudden ray of sunshine, Jennifer walked in. She was wearing a light blue coat, a color like a flower blooming in winter, her soft brown hair falling loosely over her shoulders, and her eyes sparkling like stars. But what attracted Beau the most was Jennifer's smile, a radiant, warm smile, as if it could dispel all the darkness around. Beau, who was used to the coldness and loneliness, felt like his heart had just been awakened. He couldn't take his eyes off her, like someone drowning in darkness suddenly seeing the light. Jennifer was not only beautiful, she also exuded intelligence and an attractive confidence. She spoke passionately about scientific experiments, loved the little things in life, and was always optimistic with a belief in the future. She was like a breath of fresh air, blowing away the walls of solitude that Beau had tried to build up over the years. They quickly became friends, having long conversations in the lab, over hot cups of coffee and old books. Beau, who always hid his emotions, suddenly felt that he could be open and himself when he was with Jennifer. She not only saw his weaknesses but also accepted them, and that made him feel safe and loved. One starry night, as they looked at the night sky together, Jennifer told Beau about her favorite constellations, about ancient stories, and her dreams. Beau, who was used to doubt and skepticism, suddenly felt the beauty of life. It was Jennifer's passion and love for the little things that made him love her more than anything else. But deep inside, Beau still couldn't completely shake off his insecurities and fears. He knew that he wasn't worthy of Jennifer, that she loved an image he had tried to present, not his true self. Jennifer's hopeful and loving gaze, on one hand, made him feel happy, but on the other hand, became a burden, making him even more afraid of the truth and what could happen. The seeds of a tragedy had begun to sprout, right at the moment when love was just budding. After 2 years of romantic dating, Beau decided to propose to Jennifer at the same place where they first met, in the laboratory where their love began. Jennifer accepted with emotion, and at that moment, Beau felt like the happiest man in the world. He believed that Jennifer's love would heal his emotional wounds, that he could start a new life, a life full of joy and happiness. The wedding took place in a romantic setting, with friends and family offering their blessings. Beau and Jennifer became a family, and their early days of marriage were filled with laughter and sweet memories. But like a dark cloud gradually covering the blue sky, the pressures of life began to overwhelm them, and the hidden conflicts in their relationship gradually surfaced. Jennifer always longed for a family. She often shared with Beau about the children she desired, about small houses filled with children's laughter. But whenever he heard Jennifer talk about it, Beau felt a sense of anxiety arise within him. He wasn't sure he was ready for the responsibility of being a father. He still had too many fears and doubts. He often just smiled, avoided Jennifer's gaze, and changed the subject to other topics. In conversations about the future, Beau often dodged questions about children, unable to face the prospect of becoming a father, of bearing the responsibility of raising a small life. Sometimes, Beau even felt suffocated by Jennifer's love and care. He felt as if he was being bound, losing the freedom he yearned for. The fears from the past, the pressures and insecurities within him, had not disappeared. They were still smoldering, just waiting for an opportunity to erupt. Then, when Jennifer was diagnosed with endometriosis, Beau felt a selfish relief. In a shameful moment, he told himself that, at least, having children would be delayed. He thought this was a sign, an opportunity for him to avoid the responsibilities he didn't want. He knew it was wrong to think that, but he couldn't stop those negative emotions from surfacing. And then, Jennifer announced she was pregnant. The news was like a bolt of lightning, shattering the false peace that Beau had tried to build. He saw the joy in Jennifer's eyes, but in him, panic began to rise. He felt suffocated, as if the whole world was weighing on his shoulders. A question echoed in his mind. Is there a way to escape all this? And dark thoughts began to creep in, becoming increasingly haunting, like a devil whispering in his ear. After learning that Jennifer was pregnant, Beau felt lost in a maze of dark thoughts. He began to seek an escape, a way out of the responsibilities that he felt were too much. And in the darkness of despair, he turned to another woman, someone he considered a lover, an escape from reality. The relationship with the lover was never true love. It was just an escape, a place where Beau didn't have to face expectations and responsibilities. The lover would often send him messages in the middle of the night, as if she knew he was sitting alone, immersed in darkness and confused thoughts. "You deserve to be free," she wrote, and those words echoed in Beau's head, becoming a justification for his wrong actions. The lover never directly said that Beau should leave Jennifer, but all her words and actions sowed seeds for the ideas that Beau was afraid to admit. He began to think that he could live a life without Jennifer, without any attachments. But each time he thought about that, a sense of guilt would pull him back. He didn't know if it was love for Jennifer or just fear of losing the facade of a perfect husband. Meanwhile, Jennifer gradually noticed the change in Beau. She didn't say anything, but her gaze was different. She looked at him longer, as if trying to find the man she had once loved. One evening, as they sat next to each other on the sofa, Jennifer took Beau's hand and said, "I know something's wrong with you lately, but we can get through this, right?" Beau didn't answer. He just quietly got up, left the room, leaving Jennifer alone in uneasy silence. In the days that followed, Beau felt like he was living in two worlds. One world was the house with Jennifer, where everything was orderly but suffocating. The other world was the messages, the whispers from the lover, a promise of the freedom he craved. He didn't know where he was going, but step by step, he felt himself getting closer to a decision from which there was no turning back. The light in their home grew dimmer and dimmer. Jennifer began to confine herself to the bedroom, while Beau spent time in the basement, where he pretended to fix things that didn't exist. He began to buy bleach, gloves, and other things. But even as he did that, he didn't know what he was going to do. Every action he took seemed to be driven by an invisible force, dark thoughts growing stronger and stronger until they completely controlled him. One night, when Beau entered the bedroom, he saw Jennifer crying. The light from the nightstand reflected on her face, making her look like a ghost. "I don't know where we went wrong," she said, sobbing, "but I still love you." Beau stood there, saying nothing, feeling only coldness in his heart. He didn't know that it was the last time he would hear Jennifer's voice. Beau didn't remember the details of that night clearly. It started like any other night. He was sitting alone in the basement, the dim light from the fluorescent bulb above his head. But this time, everything seemed clearer, as if he was crossing a thin line between reality and a nightmare. Dark thoughts, the voices in his head, had now become an irresistible command. He walked up the stairs, his hand gripping the sledgehammer tightly. The cold wooden handle transmitted through his trembling palm. The hallway was dark, with only a faint light coming from the bedroom. Jennifer stood there, her figure still as if she was ready to face it. But Beau knew that her gaze wasn't one of fear but of disappointment in him. "Beau, what are you doing?" Her voice whispered, breaking into the silence. He heard her words, but his mind was empty. Images of their early days together flashed by like an old movie. Jennifer smiling in the sunlight, her loving gaze when he proposed to her, their laughter echoing in the night. But now, all that remained was darkness. He closed his eyes, feeling the coldness of the heavy sledgehammer in his hand. "Just do it, and everything will end," the voice in his head urged. He swung his arm, the heavy feeling when the hammer made contact, a dry sound echoing, tearing through the silence. Jennifer fell to the floor, but her eyes were still fixed on him, full of pain and despair. Everything became blurry. His breathing was heavy, the air suffocating like a stranglehold. He knelt beside her, his trembling hand touching her lifeless face. "What have I done?" A question repeated itself in his head, but no one answered. Darkness engulfed him, and only the sound of his heart pounding echoed in his chest. He dragged Jennifer's lifeless body down to the basement. The basement was cold, the dim fluorescent light dancing on the walls as if mocking him. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the empty space, each sound like an indelible indictment. He placed Jennifer on the floor, the old blanket still wrapped tightly around her body. Blood had soaked through the fabric, leaving dark stains on the concrete floor. Beau looked around, trying to find a solution. Bleach, gloves. The things he had prepared earlier now seemed like evidence of a carefully calculated plan. But he didn't remember what he had been thinking when he bought them. It was all just one long delirium. He bent down, starting to clean up the blood on the floor. His hands were trembling, each movement heavy as if his body was resisting itself. The smell of bleach was pungent, stinging his eyes, but it wasn't enough to mask the metallic smell of blood, a smell that he knew would haunt him forever. When Beau paused to breathe, his eyes unintentionally met Jennifer's. Her face was completely still now, but her half-closed eyes seemed to reproach him, silent but painful. He turned away, unable to look longer. He tried to erase all traces, mopping the floor, washing the blanket, cleaning up the surroundings. But there was no way to erase the guilt gnawing from deep inside. Every time he touched anything, it became a reminder of his actions. He stopped, leaning against the wall, his body tired and his mind blank. What should I do next? A question echoed in his mind, but there was no answer, only a deathly silence, as if the room itself was judging him. Beau drove through the night, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The road leading to the outskirts seemed endless, darkness enveloping everything around, leaving only the faint headlight shining straight ahead. Jennifer was in the back, wrapped in the old blanket. He avoided looking in the rearview mirror. Her gaze seemed to still be there, even though he knew that was impossible. The car stopped on a trail leading into the woods. Beau got out, the cold night air cutting through his skin. Shadows of trees covered the path, the wind whistling through the leaves creating a sound like whispers. He pulled Jennifer out of the trunk, her body light, but each step was heavy as if the whole world was weighing on his shoulders. He placed her under a tree, where the moonlight only dimly illuminated. Beau bent down, looking at her face one last time. An absolute silence enveloped them, with only the wind and the sound of his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but the words were meaningless. It couldn't ease the pain, nor could it erase what he had done. He covered her body with leaves and soil, handful by handful, his hands trembling. Each layer of soil gradually concealed Jennifer, as if he was burying himself. When he finished, he stood there, not moving, not thinking, He just stared at the empty space in front of him, as if waiting for a miracle that would bring her back. But nothing happened. He turned away, his steps faltering. In his head, a huge void replaced all thoughts. When he got back into the car, his hand instinctively rested on the steering wheel. He didn't know where he was going, or what he was doing. He just drove, leaving everything behind: Jennifer, their marriage, and the person he used to be. Beau drove aimlessly through the streets he couldn't remember the names of. Everything outside the window became blurred, as if the world around no longer existed. In his head, every image repeated itself: Jennifer's gaze, the dry sound of the hammer, and the cold earth where he left her. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He just drove, like a lost soul. When the car stopped on a familiar street, he realized he was back home. The lights in the living room were still on. The family photos hanging on the wall were still there. But the house now felt like a tomb. He stepped inside, a cold feeling invading every cell. He sat on the sofa, where Jennifer and he used to sit together, and turned on the TV. Voices from the screen rang out, but he didn't hear anything. In the days that followed, Beau lived like a ghost. He went to work, greeted his colleagues, but everyone noticed that something was wrong. "You don't look well," they said, but he just gave a forced smile. During the long nights, he lay in the empty house, the light from the nightstand casting shadows on the ceiling. The sound of his heartbeat echoed in his chest, as if reminding him that he was still alive, while Jennifer was not. The doorbell rang, cutting through the heavy silence of the house. The lights in the hallway cast shadows of the police officers standing outside the door, their expressions serious and determined. They had come after receiving a missing person report from Eleanor, Jennifer's close neighbor. "We are the police. We need to check if Miss Jennifer is okay," one officer with a stern face said, extending his badge. Beau stood there, frozen, a feeling of coldness spreading through his body. He knew that his escape had come to an end. The police didn't enter immediately. Instead, they politely asked Beau to open the door to check on the situation. As the door cracked open, a cold draft swept in, and the police began to observe carefully. Their eyes didn't miss a single detail, from the family photos on the wall to the objects on the table. "We just need to confirm that Ms. Jennifer is all right," a policewoman said, her voice soft but firm. "Could you let us in for a moment?" Beau, although trying to stay calm, felt a surge of anxiety. He reluctantly agreed and stepped back to let the police enter. While some of the police spoke to Beau, others quickly observed their surroundings. They noted the position of objects, their eyes not leaving any corner of the room. A younger police officer, with a serious expression, approached the staircase leading to the basement. "There's a strange smell," he said, his voice not hiding suspicion. The smell of bleach wafted by, arousing a sense of unease in everyone. He didn't go down to the basement immediately, but instead observed from above. After a brief conversation, the police politely said goodbye, but they didn't leave. Instead, they observed the house from the outside, recording details and discussing the unusual signs. "I don't like that smell," the police chief, a middle-aged man with many years of experience, said with a pensive tone. "I think we need a search warrant." Meanwhile, another group of police officers began to examine Beau's car. They didn't open the trunk right away, but instead observed from the outside, noting details such as the paint color, license plate, and stains on the car body. Some officers were sent to nearby houses to collect video footage from security cameras. After some time, the police returned to the station to report what they had gathered. All the unusual signs, from the smell of bleach, Jennifer's absence, to Beau's car, raised suspicions. The police chief quickly requested an emergency search warrant from the court. Based on the preliminary evidence gathered, the court approved and issued a search warrant. With the warrant in hand, the police returned to Beau's house. The police chief quickly requested an emergency search warrant from the court. Based on the preliminary evidence gathered, the court approved and issued a search warrant. With the warrant in hand, the police returned to Beau's house. This time, they were no longer polite. They stormed into the house, determined to find the truth. The basement was dark and damp, the smell of bleach stinging everyone's nostrils. A blood stain, despite being cleaned, was still visible under the flashlight. The sledgehammer, with traces of a red liquid, was found behind a stack of rotting wood. While the police were searching the house, a technician extracted videos from security cameras. The images of Beau's car leaving the house the night before, heading towards the trail leading to the West Woods, appeared clearly on the screen. At the same time, the police searched Beau's phone using the warrant from the court. Midnight messages with a strange number, sweet and suggestive words, appeared on the screen. The police chief read through the messages, his face growing more serious. "You lied," he said, his voice as cold as a blade. "You know what happened to Jennifer. All the evidence is against you." Beau looked down, unable to face the police chief's gaze. All his attempts to escape, all his lies and pretenses, had become meaningless. He was surrounded by undeniable evidence. He knew that there was no way to escape. A police officer placed his hand on Beau's shoulder. "You are under arrest for murder," he said, his voice firm. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you." Beau felt his legs give out. The world around him blurred, and he knew that all the things he had feared had finally come true. The net had closed in, and no one could escape it. Beau sat in the interrogation room, the fluorescent light overhead shining directly on his face, highlighting his exhaustion and confusion. He was wearing a gray jumpsuit, the clothes the police had provided for him. The feeling of guilt still clung to him like a second skin. Across from him, the police chief sat silently, his gaze piercing. He was in no hurry, not impatient, but just patiently waiting for Beau to speak. Next to him, a policewoman with a recording device was carefully noting down every word. "We know you lied." The police chief broke the silence, his voice deep and steady. "We know what you did to Jennifer." Beau was silent, his head bowed down. He didn't want to look directly into the eyes of the police. He was afraid of what might reflect in them. "The evidence is overwhelming," the police chief continued, still in the same tone. "The blood in the basement, the hammer, the smell of bleach. Those messages, they are all against you. And also, you knew Jennifer was pregnant, didn't you?" Beau startled and looked up, his eyes full of surprise and pain. He had tried to forget that detail, tried to deny the fact that he had not only taken Jennifer's life, but also that of a small, unborn being. "Tell me, Beau," the police chief said, his voice a little softer, as if trying to reach someone who was desperate. "What happened that night? What did you do to Jennifer and your child?" Beau was silent for a moment, trying to suppress the emotions surging within him. He took a deep breath and began to tell the story, his voice trembling at first, but then becoming stronger and more decisive. He talked about the pressures, the fears that had tormented him for so long, about the betrayal and despair that had led him to that fateful night. When Beau recounted the night he hit Jennifer with the hammer, he couldn't hold back his tears. His words were full of pain and remorse, as if he was punishing himself with those horrific memories. The police chief and the policewoman listened without interruption. When Beau finished his story, the entire room was engulfed in heavy silence. "Where did you leave Jennifer's body?" the police chief asked, his voice still deep and steady. Beau was silent for a moment, then pointed to a location on a map on the table. "In the West Woods, on a small trail," he said, his voice almost a whisper. The police chief ordered a search team to go to that area immediately. After a long search, they discovered an area that had been disturbed, and beneath a layer of leaves and soil, they found Jennifer's body. The scene shocked all the police officers. Jennifer was lying motionless, her face still bearing an expression of pain, and her body was wrapped in the old blanket. A feeling of sorrow and anger surged in everyone when they realized that a small life had also been taken away so cruelly. When Jennifer's body was taken back to the forensic lab, the truth about her death became clear. The autopsy confirmed that she had died from a fatal blow to the head with a hard object, and the bloodstains on the hammer were hers. Meanwhile, Beau was still sitting in the interrogation room, his eyes red and his face tired. He knew that his life had completely collapsed. All that remained was belated remorse and a future in prison. He had not only killed Jennifer, but also his unborn child. When the news of the murder and the detail about the unborn child were released to the media, Everyone was shocked, heartbroken, and outraged. The story of Beau and Jennifer became a terrible tragedy, a warning about the pressures, fears, and cruelty that people can commit when they lose themselves. The trial of Beau took place in a tense and somber atmosphere. The courtroom was packed, mostly with Jennifer's relatives and friends, and members of the public who were interested in this shocking case. Their faces were filled with sorrow, anger, and curiosity to know the truth behind this tragedy. Beau entered the courtroom, his hands cuffed, his appearance weary and exhausted. He was no longer the confident and elegant man people used to know. He sat with his head bowed, avoiding the eyes of those around him. Beau's defense lawyer tried to argue for leniency, emphasizing the psychological pressures Beau had endured, his fears and anxieties. They tried to argue that Beau was a victim of circumstances, someone who had been pushed to the edge. However, the prosecutor countered those arguments, emphasizing the cruelty and inhumanity of Beau's actions. They presented undeniable evidence: the bloodstains, the hammer, the messages, Beau's statements during the interrogation, and the fact that Jennifer was pregnant. They also called Beau's lover to the witness stand. "Did you have a relationship with the defendant, Beau?" the prosecutor asked sternly. "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling. She was a young, beautiful woman, but her eyes were full of anxiety and unease. "Did you know that the defendant had a family?" the prosecutor continued. "I knew," she replied, her voice fading. "What kind of conversations did you and the defendant have?" She was silent for a moment, then began to talk about the late-night messages, the sweet and seductive words, the secret meetings, and the promises of a life of freedom. She said that Beau had told her about his unhappy marriage, about the pressures and responsibilities he didn't want to bear. "I never encouraged him to do anything," she said, her voice sounding as if she was defending herself. "I was just a listener, his friend." The prosecutor asked her about the messages that Beau had sent her, messages in which he said that he felt trapped, that he wanted to escape from his marriage. "Did you know that the defendant had murdered his wife and his unborn child?" the prosecutor asked, his voice firm. She was silent, tears welling up. "I didn't know," she said, her voice choking. "I can't believe it." Her testimony plunged the entire courtroom into silence. Everyone felt the cruelty and selfishness of Beau's actions. He had not only betrayed his wife, but also used another woman to escape his responsibilities. After her testimony, Beau's defense lawyer had an even harder time defending his client. They couldn't deny what had happened, and they couldn't justify Beau's inhumane actions. Throughout the trial, Beau remained silent and bowed his head. He didn't refute any of the accusations, nor did he try to justify his actions. He knew that nothing could change what had happened. Nothing could bring Jennifer back to life. After days of tense hearings, the jury handed down its final verdict. Beau was sentenced to life in prison without parole for murder, a severe sentence but deserved for the crimes he had committed. After the trial, the story of Beau and Jennifer continued to be mentioned, becoming a bitter lesson about the fragility of life and the terrible consequences that avoidance could cause. Everyone realized that pressures, fears, and anxieties could lead people to unforgivable acts. The story ended with the image of Beau sitting in a dark prison cell, lonely and despairing. He looked out the window, seeing the gloomy sky and heavy dark clouds. He knew that the ghosts of Jennifer and his unborn child would haunt him for the rest of his life. Beau's story is not just a personal tragedy, it is also a warning to us all. It reminds us that we need to face our fears, responsibilities, and pressures in life, and never allow ourselves to run away or give up. We need to learn to love, accept, and forgive, both ourselves and those around us. Only then can we avoid similar tragedies and build a better life.